Okay, thank you for joining us. We'll start off with questions or comments coming from the House.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair. We have reviewed the offer that was presented in which the Sunflower Education Equity Account or Program or Act would be struck, and many of its contents would be moved over to the Kansas Education Enrichment Program. That's a big stretch for the House, but I think that is a good response, and the House will accept.
Okay, are there any questions from committee? Yes, Senator? Representative Nguyen, I apologize.
No apologies. Just can't be in two places. Okay, so I just have some questions, please, for clarity, because this is a big stretch. I'll agree with that. Help me understand your definition, clarity for what's an award and what's a grant, and put the monetary value on it, please.
Well, the monetary value for those students that are attending our public schools, that grant is $1,000.
So that's what you mean grant by the definition grant? So that but it says it's pursuant to section 6. But that's okay. If the grant's 1,000 and the award is then,
The award is $1,000.
okay, you just said the grant.
You're right.
I know. Okay, so the grant is $5K, the award is $1,000.
Yes,
Okay,
roughly $5,000.
okay, all right,
It is a percentage of base state aid.
okay. And so that's on page 1. On page 2, number 7, a qualified education service provider means any business? So I guess I'm stuck on the business.
Well, there are a variety of different businesses. So it could be that they're receiving tutoring services. So there may be a business for that.
Okay.
They may be receiving, when we refer to even the reading center that's down at Pittsburgh State University, there is a cost associated with the treatment that the children receive there that have been diagnosed with dyslexia. It could be the business that's been set up as far as for music instruction, because there may be a school district that doesn't offer instrumental. It might be that they've got band, but they don't have strings,
Okay.
vice versa.
We're good. Okay, then on B, small Roman numeral 2, help me understand that the student has already been in the program? This is the first time, am I reading that correctly? I'm on page 2, B, item number 2, small Roman numeral 2.
That's
The
looking
student-
forward. So once they've filled out that application, once they're enrolled in the program,
Okay. And so that 5K is let's say, until they graduate from college,
no,
high school?
it's only through school.
Okay, through,
Through 12.
okay, K through 12. So then, the bottom of page 2,
That's what's on A above there. It says, is enrolled
I
in
see,
attending.
okay, thank you. The program shall, the last sentence on 2, help me just remember what program was approved by the State Finance Council.
The keep.
Oh, that was, okay. Thank you. Here's a question on page 3. You're saying that will the program be transferred to the state treasurer's office? Will the KEEP program?
It will be.
Okay. But this morning,
But they'll maintain that contract.
maintain a contract.
So right now, the third-party vendor, Merit, they'll maintain that contract.
You're mandating to the state treasurer that they will do that? Did I not see that in there, or that just assumed? What line? Maintain. Okay. And the reason I'm asking these questions, we haven't discussed this, so maybe you all did, but I wasn't privy to a discussion, so. Well, obviously I wasn't. So the 1,000 is for those who go to public schools. The 5K are those to go to private schools.
It's just the non-public.
Non-public. Is a private a non-public? It is one form of non-public.
It's one form of
Okay,
non-public.
okay. So there's, so did you leave the word equity in, or did you take the word equity out? I think you took the word equity out, right? In the title, which is probably the best.
I mean, we have changed the name here.
Right, so you took the word equity out. Good thinking. Explain over on page 4 about a child with an IEP. The state treasurer makes that decision. Page 4, C, like cat. Does it start with B, the treasurer shall, 1 through 4, then A, B, C, or allowable uses of money? Page 4, middle of the page. Large capital C, not small.
So ask your question again.
Explain large capital C.
Okay. So a student with an IEP or a 504, if they are attending a non-public institution, funding does not go from the state to that non-public institution for those services. So the parents can decide to have the public institution provide those services, or can decide to not have their child receive those services.
But if the non-public school is able to provide those services, can the funds be used to?
They're required by law to provide services, but in non-public schools, those services are provided by the public school district.
So the parent cannot use the funds in a non-public school?
Well, that's not what that is about. The parent can use the funds in the non-public school, but that has nothing to do with the services that a child that has an IEP or 504 is to receive.
Do you have clarification, Representative Williams?
JG.
I think this was in the original bill. It was in Senate Bill 83. And if you have a student that receives special education services in a public school, you also receive potentially transportation that's designed based on their need. If you take your child to, by choice, to a non-public school, you still do have rights to those types of services, but you must bring that child to the resident school district. They do not have to provide the services at the non-public school. They could, It could be a negotiated agreement to do so, but it is not required. Now, Kansas statute steps one bit further than federal. Federal would allow that. Federal law does not prohibit special education dollars to go to services at a private school. But in Kansas statute, and it should be updated and changed because I think it's not constitutional. It's not constitutional. We prohibit that. So what parents need to understand is if you have a student that receives special services and you remove them from the public school, there are some benefits that are going to change. You may need to provide the transportation. You may need to bring that child back into the district for services. If you need services every single hour of every single day and you're in a non-public school, you may not be able to receive those services. And so that's why it's in there, is to clearly inform the parent of their rights.
But there are some communities, Lewisburg is one of the communities that, we have a private school within the community, and the IEP services are delivered there at the private school. So the individuals do go to the private school and deliver those from the school district. It really is district by district as to how that is addressed. Well, there we go, building by building. Did you have something more to say?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would also say that many private schools or non-public schools specialize in special education services. So they may choose not to use their funding that is through the public schools because there are dyslexia centers, there are even parents that work with their children at home. So it's more about giving that parent that opportunity to make that decision.
And just for clarity again, the 1,000 is one time only,
It is awarded one time.
and the 5,000 is K through 12, ongoing.
It's ongoing on an annual basis.
Correct.
Right. Now, the 1,000 doesn't have to be spent in 1 year. So there is that. Yes.
So on the 5,000, then does the student qualify every year in case their income changes?
The student would need to make sure that they still fit that eligibility.
And one last question, please, on page 8.
Is there not a stipulation in there right now? If the qualification changes?
Certainly. Thank you, Madam Chair. So if the qualification of a student's income level changes, there is the requirement in the bill that it would not affect that student's continued participation to continue receiving those grant amounts. Once they qualify with 250%, they're in as long as they continue attending private school.
Okay, so then add on top of that, page 8, number 6, the qualified student may accept a scholarship from a scholarship granting organization pursuant to the tax credit, so that they can layer this on top of that.
I'm sorry, say that again.
They could layer this on top of that?
Of the tax credit?
Correct.
They could.
Okay, just for clarification. All right, thank you for your explanation.
But the tax credit is part of what got gutted from 83, so we will revisit that.
But that's in there right now, correct?
No,
That is in there right now.
just the layering, but as far as the actual language, that's not
But
bad.
the layering is there, because we have existing law.
We do.
Thank you.
Representative?
But with the tax credit, that comes from a nonprofit organization that is set up to receive those dollars. Those do not come from the state.
No, that's external.
So that's why it would layer, because it's a separate program that we don't necessarily control that piece of it.
I just wanted to make sure we weren't talking about the tax credit that came out of the tax committee.
That's why I use the term layer.
Layer, stacking, higher ed refers to it as
Stack.
stacking.
Right. At the end of the day, it means you can
You're eligible for both.
both, which translates as dollars.
Does. Yes, Representative.
But keep in mind, the tax credit is given to an individual that is not using the tax credit. The money the individual donated to that nonprofit, and I think there's another term probably in the tax code for that, is that money is that organization's money to provide scholarships for schools that they represent. So that's why I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with the word stack, because the tax credit is given to an individual that does not benefit from the scholarship dollars that that entity receives.
I think the distinction needs to be made that a child can be eligible for the scholarship and can also participate in this as well. I think it's also important that the tax credit scholarship for low-income children, an individual that puts money into the scholarship cannot earmark it for a child. It cannot be that I'm making this contribution and it's to be assigned or used for this child. Yes.
And thank you for the clarity. But at the end of the day, the child and the family can access these funds. That's all I'm saying. That, comfort or no comfort, at the end of the day, if all the stars are in alignment, okay, you rather it like that?
And quite frankly, it could be a family where one child is attending public school, and the family, if eligible, would be able to participate in the KEEPS grant, $4,000, but they might have another child that's attending a private. So there are, Representative.
Well, but I think, we're crossing funds in here, Representative, when that money is donated to that nonprofit, it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with that nonprofit deciding that a child is eligible for receiving funds to go to whatever private schools that organization may represent. So that's not, I know people want to split hairs on what's tax dollars and what's not tax dollars, but it's two different processes, and it's also two different statutes.
So Representative Williams and then Senator Sykes.
All right, yeah, thank you. I think we don't want to lose sight of who this is serving. This is actually serving low-income students. Right now, the tax credit for tax scholarship for low-income families have to be at 185% federal poverty level. This is 250% federal poverty level. The approximate amount of money your household could make to qualify if you were a family of four for 250% is $60,000. We heard testimony in K-12 education budget from Independent School in Wichita. Now, if a student is low income, they cannot afford that $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 a year tuition. They couldn't afford it with this, and they cannot afford it with the low-income tax scholarship, which maxes out at $8,000 per student. However, the average amount is between 4 to 5. So even adding the two together, depending on what school you might want to go to, because the tax credit for low-income students requires accredited school. And so that is a more narrow base. So again, it's helping low-income students fulfill their dreams, perhaps, to go to a school that they would not otherwise be able to go to. And that's why, in a sense, it's allowing the two to work together.
I was wondering if we could please hear from the House with regard to the Special Education Task Force. The Special Education, I'm sorry, Senator Sykes. Senator Sykes.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. First, so currently the KEEP program is funded through ARPA dollars.
Correct.
And I understand the $1,000, how that ARPA, so would the $5,000 grant also come from those funds? And is there, like, would it drain the 47.5 million that's currently in there, and then it would go to SGF?
No, it would not drain.
It would not come from this, okay, so it's two separate pots of money. So then that brings my next question, because I know Merrick currently is doing the KEEP program, and I don't see a mechanism in this. Under the current bill, there's a mechanism for the parents getting that $5,000 grant for a way to do that. Is there anything in this on how that would be distributed to them? Because it was like a savings account that they had access to in the previous version.
It's going to be the similar process. Yeah. It does have the same thing as far as rules and regs through the treasurer.
Okay. And the grant would come from SGF, but the award would come from the KEEP fund in the ARPA.
The KEEP fund right now currently is ARPA. We are going to talk a little bit as we move forward. In fact, and as soon as we can address the issue with regard to the task force, then we'll jump into another issue with regard to ARPA funding, depending on how much time we have remaining.
Okay, thank you.
So did you want to talk a little bit about the task force?
Sure. The Special Education Funding Task Force, it already existed in law in about 2008, and then I think it expired in 2012. The task force, we decided it was very important because of our interim meeting that we had, in which we were able to identify the flaws in the formula. If you think about the special education funding formula, it calculates funding one way and distributes in another way. It uses 4 ways to allocate funds, and one of those is teacher entitlement, whereas our student funding formula for regular education is based on student weightings. This is not. You could have a lot of students, but maybe a different, a high number of teachers or a lower number of teachers, and the teacher entitlement is really going to make a huge impact on how much money you receive. So what we found out in our interim, Madam Chair, if you remember, some school districts were at 300% excess costs, and some school districts were at 60% excess costs, and that's not equitable. And I don't think that the intent of the legislation was to create such huge disparities between school districts. So we need to make sure and correct the disparity rather than just add more money. So the thought and what SB 83 did was it included language to re-implement the Special Education Funding Task Force, because it's a funding committee that looks at the funding of special education. It would have up to 6 members that would be appointed by the Senate and the House. 2 members to be the Speaker of the House, 2 members, the President of the Senate. 1 minority leader appoints 1 minority leader of the Senate, 1 member appointed by the State Board of Education, and 2 members to be appointed by the Kansas Department of Education who are professionals in the field of special education and related services, and 1 member to be a parent of a student who receives special education services. And so they would provide recommendations to the legislature on the appropriate funding options moving forward.
I can share that when we discussed this matter, as far as that committee in Senate Education, it did come up, and the ask was that there needed to be representation from someone that's working in the pre-K, because pre-K is truly separate from our K through 12. And so the ask was, we had several people bring that up in their testimony, asking that we add a pre-K, someone that is working in the field with pre-K. So again, we don't really need so much someone from across the street from the Department of Education. We would rather have within the pre-K community. And we assume that that would be something that would be amenable to the House.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. That sounds like a reasonable request, and we would just need to look at the makeup of the board and decide whether or not you're wanting an additional member or if you want to remove one member. You could bring that to us, and we'd be happy to make that consideration.
So the discussion, it's proviso language right now because it is a one-time, one-year meeting. We would like to add the individual representing pre-K rather than taking someone off. We would like to make that addition. So if that was possible, if you could work on that for us. Okay. So the other thing is, are we okay on that discussion?
Yes, I think we're fine with that. Does that bring us to 11 members? Okay.
I like that because nice odd numbered committee. Who selects the person? Yes.
In the bill, as I'm looking at the language, there were 2 appointed by the state board who are professionals in the field of special education or related. I think you could add that third there.
Just have the state board, just add that to that. So if you could get that language for us, Nick, that would be helpful. So Nick, if you could go ahead and pass out what you had prepared for us. Yeah, you're okay with the special education now? No, the funding. Yeah. I did get a text. We need to make sure with that pre-K, it has to be infant toddler, so 0 to 3-year-old. It's the tiny K, yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and pass that out. And so Nick, if you want to just go ahead and explain it for the conference committee members.
Yes, so thank you, Madam Chair. So committee members, Senate Bill 83 does make appropriations for special education services aid. What this balloon is proposing to do, or this amendment is proposing to do, is reduce the SGF appropriation, essentially the enhancement request that the governor made by, and reduce that SGF appropriation by $72.4 million. So, and instead, ARPA funds would be used to fill in for that $72 million reduction to SGF funding. So you see on that second new insert section, this is establishing a special revenue fund in the Department of Education budget where these ARPA funds for special education would be placed. And the department would be expending these funds the same way that they distribute special education, state aid, and catastrophic aid. And then new section 2 down there would provide that monies that are within the Legislative Coordinating Council, the ARPA monies, from the Legislature Employment Security Fund of the LCC would be transferred in the amount of $25,359,420 to that new special revenue fund within the Department of Education. And then in new section 3, another transfer occurs. This transfer would be essentially the funds that are within the ARPA funds that have been allocated to the KEEP program, the governor's KEEP program. And as of now, with this proposed amendment, the transfer amount from those funds would be an amount of $47 million from that ARPA State Fiscal Relief Federal Fund to that new special revenue fund in the Department of Education. So the total federal fund transfers to that new special revenue fund in Department of Education for special education would be the $72 million that SGF was reduced.
So to be clear, what we are doing is we are taking the 47 million and we are shifting that over. So we're shifting it from the KEEPs and we're shifting that over so that we have that funding that will address, and to be clear, it's taking federal money to backfill, if you will, what the federal government is not providing in special education that they are obligated to provide. So we are shifting that money, so that goes over there. And then we are also taking the 25.4 million that right now the Legislative Coordinating Council, again, federal money, and we're moving that over as well so that we do have that appropriation for special education services, and that $72,359,420, that will be coming from the federal funds that the state already has. That means that we will be, if there are remainder federal funds, we will shift that over into the KEEPS program, the KEEPS grants, and any needed backfill will come from SGF on KEEPS. Are there questions? Dinah. Senator Sykes. To Representative Williams.
Okay, thank you. So I see the shift of money, and I understand, I think it's putting us in jeopardy for years forward because we have one-time funds here for that 72 million. But again, so explain to me then where the new KEEP, in our First Amendment, those KEEP dollars, and then so the awards and the grants, those are coming from SGF then because we're transferring what is currently in that program for SPED.
What we're doing is we're making sure that everyone understands where we are as far as funding for special education. Quite frankly, that has been the beat of the drum since last year. It's been the beat of the drum all year, and we are making sure that everyone understands that SPED is going to be funded. So we are filling in that portion that the federal government is not providing for special education, up to that 72.4 million. Likewise, we know that there is some significant funding as well, federal money, the ARPA funds, within the purview of the Legislative Coordinating Council. So they will be shifting funds so that the essentially that 47 million that currently is residing in the KEEP grant program, that will come from that as well. If there are other areas where there are expenditures, then that will be backfilled with SGF. Now, the interesting thing about concerns about funding, let's be clear about one particular issue, and that is these federal funds that we have right now, they expire December 31st of 2024. So to just keep holding on to those funds and not utilizing them does not make sense, because when that deadline comes, those funds disappear. So is there an obligation for special education in years following? Absolutely. But what this is assuring all school districts, the Department of Education, parents of special ed kids, that we're putting this funding in there. And that is one of the reasons that I asked the question and we addressed prior to handing this out, the Special Education Task Force. The task force does need to meet. We need to have the right people at the table. Folks that say they understand special education funding statewide and within their districts, I don't know that they could pass, the honesty test, because it is so convoluted. So we need the right people at the table, and we need to look at what is the appropriate funding amount, and are we measuring what is truly needed for special education in the right manner? Because funding special education is very different from the way in which we fund other aspects of the formula. So this allows that time for that task force to have their meetings, to make recommendations, and so additional funding would be determined next year for subsequent years. So there should be no assumptions that subsequent years are going to be based on what the governor put in her recommendation for the 5 years. And we will be watching to see what, in fact, the federal government does do. The federal government is now fairly acutely aware that they have not been living up to their obligation. And it's something that the current administration has said that they are looking at as far as changing what goes out to states. So we do need to be mindful of what might happen at the federal level. But that is one of the reasons that on the Senate side, when we were working on the Department of Education budget, we did pull out completely the governor's recommendation on special education funding. It was a 5-year recommendation, and we pulled that out. But for now, this is our recommendation for the funding for special education for K through 12. It also is the recommendation for where those monies should come from.
And thank you, I appreciate that. So I guess then my ask would be on 83 as it currently is, because I know we've had fiscal notes on the ESA and those were capped at 2,000 students per student. I don't believe this is capped at 2,000 students per year. It does have federal guidelines for the 250%. I just questioning, we know where the sped funding is coming from, but curious of what the fiscal note is on 83, that if this is what this conference passes out, and that we have an accurate number of what that is going to cost our state.
That is one of the reasons that we are working to build this. We still have several components that were not the Senate position, such as, components that were pulled as well, as far as mental health programs and things like that. So as we continue to work and build this, Senate Bill 83 as well as 113, that is how we will come to get to exactly what it is that we will need as far as funding. Senator Williams, or Representative Williams, you had a comment.
Yes, thank you. I do have a comment on the fiscal note, but I do have a question as well, making sure that I understand completely what you're provided for us in the federal funds versus the SGF compared to what we received this morning. So I will ask that question second. But in answer to the fiscal note, if you do look at a state like Arizona that had fully universal last year, and they have a population that is 7 million people versus our less than 3 million. And they had about a 2% participation rate. And if you take that and you compare the number of public school students that participated versus the non-public school participation rate, you could extrapolate for Kansas that you could have 9,000 students, which amounts to about $58 million. That could be if it were in line. Now remember, theirs was universal. They've had 30 years of choice, and we've had very little years of school choice. We've only had the tax credit for the low-income students. So that's one way you could do it. But the 250% federal poverty level really reduces any type of universality and would likely reduce that potential fiscal note. The only other thing I would say about the fiscal note before I ask my question is that when you look at 5,000 per pupil or at the 1,000, if it's 5,000 per pupil, that is 1/4 of the cost to educate the average public school student, which according to Kansas Department of Education numbers is very close to $20,000. So if you pull out the state aid portion and you look at the local amounts that might be just because of property tax that stays, then it does come out to be an additional savings of about, let's see, 60 million in savings for that population of students. So it is a tax reduction for Kansans for those students. My question is about what you've offered us. In section 7 on page 11 of the original amendment for KEEP, it specified where the monies were coming from. So I'm understanding that we would just remove some of that language, insert the language regarding the KEEP program, and then that would be demand transfer, or are we maintaining that we will look for federal funds first, and then any federal funds we don't have, then the state treasurer will estimate and there will be a demand transfer?
The intention was federal funds first,
And then the demand transfer.
then the demand transfer.
Okay. And then I think then that answers my question.
I think I do want to just respond briefly to what's been said by the chair of House Education. So public schools, as we continue to work on this bill, public schools will continue to be fully funded. They will be fully funded. And let's address an issue that often is not mentioned. This year, there were school districts that realized a reduction of students in their district. That is not how that district was funded. They were funded by the student population that was last year, or the year before, or the average, whichever was highest. So we do fund schools not only by the kids that are attending, but we fund schools in addition by giving that funding for students that are no longer there, that may not have been there for 2 years in that district. So when we as legislators receive emails about don't do this because you won't be funding schools, we will continue to fund schools. And should 10 kids or 100 kids move out from a district, they might be moving to another district. They might be moving to private education in some manner. We will continue to fund those schools that have had the loss in students. When you hear about school districts that have struggled, that have laid off faculty members or shut buildings, it's because they had a significant loss during and following the shutdown of COVID, and they did not regain that population. Yet they were funded for that population, but now that we are at that point where we are working to being 3 years out of, those funds aren't there because those students haven't been there for 2 years, and yet they've received funds as if they were there. So I think it's really important when we talk about school funding, and we will continue to receive, I'm sure, text messages and emails about, why aren't you fully funding? Why are you taking money away from schools? We're not taking money away from schools. We're not taking money away from schools. And in fact, one of the questions after our first meeting about the $1,000 keeps was, wait a minute, this is for public school kids? Yes, it is. And I want each of you to think about your public school or the schools in the districts that you represent, those of you that are legislators sitting here. Imagine if your school districts really make sure that families that are on free and reduced know about these, know about this opportunity. You know, one thing that we don't talk about much, but is a reality, is how much parents have to pay at the start of a school year. Those fees for their kids just to be a student in public school. On the Senate side, we had a run done just on textbook fees that every school district collects. July 1 of this year, July 1 of 2022, the unencumbered funds exceeded $76 million. That is $76 million that came out of parents' pockets, paid to schools, and they've not been used on textbooks. We have some school districts that have more than $20 million sitting there, unused. So parents are putting in money through fees. Taxpayers are funding whether they have children going to school or not, whether they have any children or any grandchildren in the state of Kansas. We are funding schools. What we're trying to do is find ways to help our kids and the learning losses that they have experienced. So that's what the KEEPS grants will do. They will help those kids that are attending our public. They will help those kids whose families have made a different choice. But to be clear, our school districts in this state will continue to be fully funded. What the funds for SPED will be the year after, that's to be determined. There are other issues that we will have to address. We're going to keep working on it as we move forward. But I don't want anyone to leave this room thinking we're cutting funds for schools, because we most certainly are not. We will make adjustments. We are going to have to make adjustments because we now know that there's at least 7 different school districts that are looking at closing schools so that they can cleave out a building, and that perhaps those students won't come anymore to that district, but they'll be getting paid as if those kids were there. That is not a solution for our rural Kansas schools. And we as legislators are going to have to work with the Department of Education, with our State Board of Education members, to make sure we are looking out for our kids and our families. And we can't have the system skated so that we can eliminate that obligation of those kids because they're not going to drive 30 miles or 45 miles to the next closest building, but we'll still get the funding coming in as if they were ours. That's not going to help any community. It's not going to help any family, and it sure isn't going to help. It's not going to be what's best for our children. So I'm going to stop there. We have a lot of things to consider. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if you would just give us a couple moments, you provided us a funding change, and it just would be a good idea for the House to take a moment, look at that. We can come back in just a couple of minutes. And in terms of this, the funding task force, we are good with adding one member. So I think we just have one item on the table. Okay.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so I think that overall, we really like the plan because when you have federal dollars and risking losing those federal dollars that the governor has in place for keep, at this rate, only $2.5 million has been expended. So at this rate, if we were to move at that pace, not all those dollars would be expended. So the idea of using federal funding, moving that into special education does not require maintenance of effort, but it does fulfill the governor's budget, which adds the $72.3 million with federal money. And I can't tell you, I think it's brilliant because the feds owe us $300 million approximately every year. So we're using their federal money to basically fill the hole that they have created. And for many of you that may be following what's happening in Washington, D.C., President Biden put forth a budget that was really big, $6.7 trillion, and in that was $2.3 billion for special education. And 1% of that is $300 million. So if any of that becomes a reality, then we have not created a maintenance of effort of state general funds. Instead, we're going to be using the federal dollars for the 72.3 million, which I think is brilliant. I love that. In terms of the KEEP, I also like the plan of backfilling it with state general fund, but looking for federal dollars first. So we accept.
Thank you very much. I think it now would be a good time to pivot and talk about, yes, you may.
Help me find again where the money, where the money, what? Where, help me find again the money, okay, on your new insert, appropriate the above agency from the following special revenue fund. Question for JG. Can you transfer federal funds to a special revenue fund? Okay, so you're just using different words. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I think now would be a good time if we pivoted to Senate Bill 113. One of the things that I would like to start with is if we could just have a brief overview. And then I do think that right off the bat, we need to talk about getting what was the base of Senate Bill 83. So the low-income scholarship, we want to make sure that we are addressing that as well. So if you would go ahead and start, Nick. It's not him.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Committee members, this chart is intended to cover the differences between the House sub for Senate Bill 113 and then the other comparable bill is the Senate budget bill. that passed the Senate floor, sub for Senate Bill 155, which contained the education budget provisions. So for fiscal year 23, for the education budget, both the House and the Senate had the same supplemental appropriations, so no differences there. In fiscal year 24, there was a difference. So in Senate Bill 113, the underlying bill, it appropriated essentially $14.8 million with an additional proviso that it had an amount attributable to a safe and secure school auditor position to audit and inspect school district safety procedures and conduct on-site audits of those safety procedures. So that cost an additional $85,000, which was added to the bill. So that is the difference between the two bills there. The Senate position did not have that auditor position added. The MHIT program in Senate Bill, House Sub for Senate Bill 113, SGF appropriation of $13.5 million. And in addition, I will note that in later sections of the bill that we'll get into, the bill establishes the MHIT program pursuant to state law, and those are in sections 4 through 8 of the bill. In the Senate's budget bill, the MHIT program, there was an SGF appropriation of essentially $10.5 million, or the Senate chose not to appropriate the additional enhancement request of $3 million for that program. With regard to school safety and security grants, House Sub for Senate Bill 113 appropriated $5 million of SGF and removed from the proviso the language to authorize those grants to be expended for acquisition of naloxone hydrochloride products. The Senate position appropriated $4 million for school safety security grants, and the Senate did not make changes to the underlying proviso as proposed in the underlying budget bills that you guys first saw this year. Special education state aid, we just kind of talked about that. So for fiscal year 24, special education state aid is included in the House version of the bill in Senate Bill 83. And then the Senate position on special education state aid under sub for Senate Bill 155 was to appropriate $520.4 million, essentially not including the enhancement request of $72 million. With regard to the state foundation aid account for fiscal year 24, the House position was to appropriate $101.4 million. This is due to a $17.5 million increase that's attributable to current school year funding authorization, which is included in later sections of the bill. The Senate position appropriated, I believe, the governor's recommendation of $83.9 million, so it doesn't include the current year KISA funding authorization. The House position, in conjunction with that current year funding, had appropriated $2.4 million for supplemental state aid to cover the state aid attributable to the state foundation aid increase. From Children's Initiative funds, the House position chose not to appropriate the enhancement request for parents as teachers, so they appropriated $8.4 million, whereas the Senate's position appropriated $9.7 million and maintained that enhancement request for parents as teachers. In addition, I will note that the Senate's budget bill also reappropriated unencumbered balances of the pre-K pilot, the early childhood infrastructure, and the Imagination Library accounts. Just a provision to reappropriate any funds that were existing in those accounts and reappropriate those for fiscal year 24. The House position did not have that reappropriation provisions in there. For fiscal year 25, there is a difference between the House position and the Senate position. Again, the House position chose to appropriate, stick with the first year, $72 million additional appropriation. So this would continue that $72 million appropriation for fiscal year 25 for a total of $592 million. The Senate's fiscal year 25 special education state aid provision maintained their fiscal year 24 amount of $520.4 million. Continuing on, the House Sub for Senate Bill 113 has provisions to codify the Mental Health Intervention Team Program. So Section 4 of the bill names the act and defines a couple commonly used terms. Section 5 establishes the program and then sets forth the purpose of the program. Section 6 establishes requirements relating to the administration of the program by KSDE and the grants that school districts can receive pursuant to the new statutory authorization for this program. So school districts would be eligible for school liaison salary grants, but they cannot exceed a salary of $50,000 for the purpose of the grant. The salary can exceed that, but the grant amount for that salary cannot exceed $50,000. And then in addition, there would be a grant, a community mental health center pass-through grant that would travel through school districts and KSDE, and that would be equal to 33% of the school liaison grant. Essentially that would pass through to the partnering community mental health center that a school district is partnering with under the program. New Section 7 discusses the staffing requirements at school districts for school liaisons, for clinical therapists, and then for project managers. I'll have to look at that again, the exact term, but it discusses the staffing requirements and the obligations of the mental health intervention team staff. And then new Section 8 creates a mental health intervention team fund in all school districts. So any funds that are received under the mental health intervention team program must travel through that fund in the school district, and then expenditures for the program have to be made through there. I will note the Senate's position maintained the proviso that's been in existing law, in existing budget bills for the last, I believe, 4 years or so with this program. And so grants would be matched by school districts on a $3 of state monies to a $1 of school districts monies basis under the Senate's proposal. And the Senate did not have these new sections codified into state laws as proposed by House Sub for Senate Bill 113. New Section 9 of House Sub for Senate Bill 113 would authorize any non-public school student to participate in activities that are overseen by the Kansas State High School Activities Association if they're offered by a school district where the student resides within. So some of the criteria there is that the student, the non-public school student, has to be a resident of the district, be enrolled in a non-public school, comply with certain requirements relating to student vaccinations, meet general age and eligibility requirements, another provision in the bill provides that academic eligibility criteria for homeschool students could be established through an affidavit from the homeschool that certifies that the student is mastering the material in each course and maintaining satisfactory academic progress. One other provision of the bill is that the student may be required by the public school to enroll in a course within the public school if that course is required for all of their students to participate in the activity. New Section 10 of the bill, of House Sub for Senate Bill 113, would provide that the KSHA, the Kansas State High School Activities Association, shall not prohibit a non-public school student from participating in any non-public school activity program if that student enrolls part-time in a public school. So they could continue to participate in their non-public school activities even if they are enrolled part-time, as long as they are primarily enrolled in a non-public school. New Section 11 of the bill would establish a requirement for parent portals on school district websites. So school districts would have to post on their website a parent portal, and it would must include the following information. So the number of non-resident students who are approved or denied enrollment under the district's open enrollment lottery system, a copy of each non-academic test, questionnaire, or survey or examination that's already required to be posted pursuant to state law in 726316, and then also a list by grade level that includes the district-wide curriculum content adopted by the school district's Board of Education. And this includes textbooks, required reading books, and units of study by theme, chapter, and subject matter. And then one other provision of the bill notes that the publications on the parent portal and the updates to that information shall be an administrative function of the school district and not a duty imposed upon the teachers of the school district. In section 12 of the bill, this would strike the prohibition that school district board members cannot be compensated for the work and duties performed by the board members, and instead would insert a provision that says school district board members may be compensated and may receive compensation from the school district for the work and duties performed by those school board members. Section 13 and 14 of the bill deals with open enrollment revisions. Section 13 of the bill would essentially state that school districts are required to permit non-resident children of the school district who are children of employees of that school district to essentially be considered as resident students under open enrollment policies. Essentially, school district employees' children would be authorized to attend the school where their parent, the school district where their parent is employed. The section 13 and 14 also amend the open enrollment law to give consideration to a student's homeless status and also require school districts to give consideration to a student's homeless status when they're adopting their open enrollment policies and when they're making decisions within the open enrollment administrative decisions within that open enrollment system. They shall consider a homeless student's status before making those decisions. Section 15 of the bill would amend the KISA school finance formula, and this would authorize school districts to use the district's current year student enrollment count to determine KISA formula funding. So currently, school districts generally have the option to use a preceding year enrollment or the second preceding year enrollment, and this would include a third option of the current year enrollment as well. Section 16 would reauthorize the 20 mil property tax levy for school years 23-24 and 24-25. Section 17 would amend the cost of living adjustment or the cost of living weighting of the KISA school finance formula. So what this would do is that it would state that any school district with an average residential home value that exceeds 115% of the statewide average residential home value would qualify for the COLA weighting. Current law does provide that that is at a 125% of the statewide average of the current home value. So this would reduce that percentage for qualification by 10%. The provisions in this bill would also increase the school district's COLA authority by increasing the COLA weighting factor, and then through revision, that revision to the qualifying average home value percentage as well, that would also bump up school district COLA authority. So under current law, there is a COLA weighting cap that is set at 5% for that weighting authority. The bill would increase that statutory COLA weighting authority cap to 7% of a district's total foundation aid, and then it would provide for continuing inflation-based increases, essentially 3-year inflation average, to continue to increase that cap by such amount. And finally, Madam Chair, there's a provision in the bill that was in both budget bills as they came through the Senate and the House to consider state aid transfers to the School District Capital Improvements Fund as demand transfers in fiscal year 23-24 and then all subsequent years thereafter. And I'd be happy to answer any questions on that.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions of Nick? I do have a few. Let's start with section 2 with the safe and secure auditor position. Is that simply from an intruder type of safe and secure, or is that taking into account the legislation that's been through the Senate and the House with regard to preventing children from being victims of sexual assault?
I believe this was more geared towards school safety and security procedures. So school door lock procedures, guest procedures, things of that nature that the schools that have received the school safety security grants, they've had adopted policies for school safety and security, and this auditor position would go and audit those procedures. And then if schools didn't receive a grant, they might still have those procedures, but this auditor would be looking to see what those school procedures are and auditing those.
In looking at section 9 with regard to KSHA activity participation, could you explain why it is more restrictive of students academically for those that are non-accredited school attendees than those that are attending our public schools to participate in KSHA? You can fail multiple courses per semester and still compete in KSHA.
Yes, there are standards here that were found in Senate Bill 113 that gave requirements for those non-public school students that if you were in a public school, if you maintain a D average, which could include a failing subject, you would be permitted to play. Now, some school districts have more stringent requirements, but these transcripts would be provided, or an affidavit would be provided to the schools by the students that were attending a non-public school. And many homeschool students have transcripts as well, but if they don't have a transcript, they could use an affidavit produced by their parents.
I guess I was just curious about that, mastering the material in each course. And obviously, when KSHA allows students attending our public schools to fail in at least 2 courses per semester, that would make the requirements more stringent for this new group of students to participate. I was just curious about that. With regard to school board, school district, boards of education compensation, who are proponents on that?
I'm gonna have to remember back if we had, it was a very short meeting. Nick, can you look at that? But they may not have provided testimony, but there are larger school districts. 259 is one of those, in which there are board members that work over 30 hours per week, going to meetings, meeting with parents, and in discussions with them. It didn't make sense to prohibit at the state level what an individual school district does. We often hear about local control. This provides local control back to these individual school districts. And as a former mayor on a city council, we were paid $1,000 per year. But even getting some kind of compensation was better than the volunteer. And we currently in statute, we allow city commissioners, we allow city council members, we allow county commissioners to receive pay. There's only a handful that we prohibit, and I don't understand why we do prohibit. A library board's prohibited, a trustee member's prohibited, and a local school board's prohibited. And all we're doing is removing the prohibition. It is not required, and I think that's the important part.
So would those be public funds? So that would come out of SGF funds, or would that be required that it be the district's perhaps foundation would provide those funds?
So just as we don't dictate to a city council that receives state funding, federal funding, local property tax funding, or we do not dictate to a county commission, we would not dictate to them. And they would have to vote. Their local school board would have to vote to provide a pay increase. And here in the Capitol, I don't think we've done that since 1975, so it's very unlikely that many of them would choose to do that. And I think in my city, there wasn't a pay raise for even longer than that. So again, I think more and more school board members are participating at a higher level. They're spending more time trying to educate themselves. And if we really want well-informed committed board members, then I think the prohibition at the state level doesn't make sense.
The last question that I have is with regard to Section 5. Wait, no. I guess it's Section 2. The 17.5 million attributable to the authorization of current year student enrollment. How many districts did we think that would impact as far as current year being higher than prior years? Do we know? Nick?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So in the fiscal note, the department estimated that it would allow an additional 3,427 students in 104 school districts to be counted at essentially that cost, $17.5 million.
Okay, could you say those numbers one more time? 3,472 students?
27 students, if I said that wrong, yeah, 3,427 students in 104 school districts.
Okay, thank you very much. I think looking at the clock, we're out of time right now. We have committee members for the next committee that is to meet, so I guess we do need to come to an agreement on what time we can begin tomorrow as far as meeting. What time do we start?
House
meeting
members,
tomorrow?
what time are we back tomorrow? We meet in,
I'm in a meeting. So I have an 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock. You're on the floor at 10? We're on at 10, correct? Let's go. You want to go for 11? Do you have an opening at 11? 11? Okay. We will, Cindy, you're going to find us a room. We'll have this room. Okay, so we will meet here at 11 tomorrow. Okay, thank you so much for your work. We are adjourned.